So talking about TRT and haematocrit. So we'll talk about what haematocrit is, why it's important, like relevant to testosterone replacement therapy, and then how microdosing TRT can actually have quite a big impact on it. So haematocrit is essentially like the concentration of red blood cells in your blood. So you can kind of think of it like oil in a car. The right consistency, everything's running smoothly, and too thick, it's going to cause the pump or the heart to work a bit harder. A normal range is kind of like 40 to 50%. I think it's important to remember that there's quite limited, like, robust data on TRT and haematocrit, but what we do know is the natural process of testosterone in the body is to stimulate like red blood cell production in the kidneys, which is, you know, all part of a normal kind of healthy process. It's not to be confused with things like polycythemia vera, which is like this kind of rare cancer, essentially when the bone marrow makes too much of a red blood cell. So you can kind of think of the difference between those two. If you think of like a flower, for example, the kidneys making red blood cells is kind of like the flowers on a single stem. The bone marrow is kind of like making loads of lots more plants to cause more red blood cells. The end result's the same. Too much of it is going to make the blood too thick and cause problems like platelet aggregation and increased risk of like strokes and just the oil through the engine being too thick, essentially. So why microdosing TRT is important in the context of haematocrit. So the kind of old school way, I want to say, or like traditional way of doing TRT is these bigger doses less frequently. So the extremes kind of every 3 months, but, you know, even monthly, for example. Basically what you're doing is you've got to put more in the system on that injection day to get enough in to do the job. But what that looks like is a big peak in levels. So it's essentially like a big signal to the body. The body doesn't know that's to kind of, you know, save for the rest of the week or rest of the month or whatever it might be. So it's just an excess signal. So it does things in excess, like make too many red blood cells. Microdosing daily avoids those big supraphysiological peaks. So in theory, we're avoiding the kind of excess production of red blood cells. In clinic, in practice, that's what we see. We really, really rarely see raised haematocrit. The two things to consider is that if you're really dehydrated, essentially it artificially makes the haematocrit look higher. Good way to think about that is just if your red blood cells are kind of rubber rings in a big ocean. The bigger the ocean, the less kind of concentrated they are. If it's really dry and you're dehydrated, there's not much water around, they're really close together and that kind of thicker flow through the blood vessels. Another thing to consider is sleep apnea. That genuinely can raise haematocrit and red blood cell production because you're dropping oxygen at night time with those pauses in breathing, that restricted airway kind of flow during night. So your body makes more red blood cells to try and compensate, thinking it's kind of clever making up for that. So those are two things to consider as well. Key takeaway points: haematocrit is the concentration of red blood cells in the blood. The thicker that is, the more your heart has to work to kind of pump everything through. So think about that oil through the engine analogy. Typical traditional ways of doing TRT is going to have those supraphysiological peaks that can exacerbate or cause more excess red blood cells to be produced. Microdosing TRT resolves that. But you've always got to consider it in the full context of the whole picture. So things like hydration and sleep apnea to consider as well.